All right, then, welcome back to Breakfast Central on News Central with Olisa Chukuma and Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Let's go straight to an interesting discuss here now. Former U.S. President Donald Trump, back in 2017, restored the Mexico City policy, often referred to as the Global Gag Rule, that was first instituted by the Reagan administration back in 1984. Now, this policy cut funding to any foreign non-governmental organization that perform or actively promote abortion as a method of, family planning.
Now, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, the policy also affected HIV, maternal health, child health, nutrition, and even malaria programs. We also have that the Action for West Africa Region Reproductive Health and Child Survival Project said that more than 1,327 communities in Ghana were affected by what is also known as the Global Gag Rule. But now, new U.S. President Joe Biden has issued an executive order to scrap the policy and release billions of dollars for life-saving services in developing countries. So, to talk about the Global Gag Rule in Africa, we have joining us Ruth Wakikona. Rose is the Senior Program Officer with the Center for Health, Human Rights and Development. Rose, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning to you all. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's get started.
All right, Rose, good morning to you. Now, let's go straight to it. Now, some people say that, the policy has saved, lives, across the African, continent. But instead, many have said that it's taking lives. What would you say about this policy as we've seen it generally?
I think this policy was retrogressive in nature because not only did it target the provision of abortion care for women, but it also targeted the provision of post-abortion care. I'll take my country as an example and put it in context. In Uganda, abortion is restricted, and you can only provide it to save the life of a mother. But by and large, it is allowed for health workers to provide post-abortion care. So if a woman comes in and she has started the process, then a health worker can go on to provide the emergency care to help her to complete the process so that her life is saved. This policy made sure that these services are not available to all women. So you cannot even take the emergency care that you so desire or that you need, because we know that when women perform unsafe abortions, they usually end up septic, they usually end up suffering so many morbidities that go along with having medical treatments at home. So if you cannot go to a hospital to get the emergency care that you need, you find that the cases of women who are dying because of abortion-related complications are very high. But you find that also the health facilities that actually provide these services don't just only provide post-abortion care, they equally provide malaria treatment, they'll provide immunization, they'll provide treatment for so many other complications of so many other diseases that are not related to abortion. So when you cut funding for these facilities, you're not just cutting funding for abortion services, but you're also cutting funding for many other diseases like malaria, even COVID-19, because we have seen facilities that have been shut down because they can no longer sustain themselves. Our country in itself only provides 30% of the health budget as a country. For the 70% of the health budget, we rely solely on development partners, which include the US, and it also includes the EU and so many other countries. So it doesn't fund the health sector by and large. And if our development partners are not willing to support our healthcare sector, then many people end up suffering.
Okay, and I think it's interesting you mentioned development partners, which is what this conversation tends to really be about when it comes to the Mexico policy. Now, while many focus on the abortion aspects of the Global Gag Rule, as you said, it's not limited to that. So when President Donald Trump expanded the rule in 2017, it totaled $8.8 billion that was actually removed from global funding. And that means everything from HIV and AIDS programming, health systems, strengthening programs that support water, sanitation, hygiene. They also announced a further restriction in 2019. But part of this conversation has to be that this is based on the whims and the caprices of a U.S. president since Reagan put this into effect during his tenure. How do we adjust that? How do we address that? How do we deal with that? So that means that even organizations and donor governments and funders are bound by the U.S. government policy, even if they're not getting money, even if they're not accepting any U.S. government money. So how do we now address this where the president in the U.S., depending on whether he's a liberal or conservative, he's pro-life or pro-choice, gets to decide how this money affects millions, if not more than that, millions of African women and children?
Yeah, I think you raise a very valid question, because we've seen the U.S. do it in so many other countries on different foreign policies. They just can't. We saw it with the Iraqi war. We saw it with the war in Afghanistan when they were trying to crack down on terror. They just make decisions on a whim, swoop into a country, destabilize it, then they move out. And they leave behind a lot of what we would call collateral damage. And it is you, the people who live within that country, who have to suffer with their whimsical decisions. But I think it comes back down to us now, even as Africans, as Ugandans. We need to take back our power. I had already mentioned that as part of our health budget, our government only supports 30%. And they were very comfortable with supporting only 30% of our budget and leaving 70% to our development partners. And then such a decision comes in and they find that most of the funding has been cut off. And you find that now facilities do not have medicines, they do not have equipment, they cannot sustain themselves, they can't pay their workers. So it becomes an issue that we throw back to ourselves. How are we going to step into the gap and begin to take on responsibility for funding ourselves? If we are looking at our cake, which would be the budget that we allocate to ourselves based on the resources that we have, how much are we allocating to the healthcare system instead of relying on the so-called development partners whose priorities are forever shifting? So I think as Africans, we need to move away from relying on aid, from relying on development partners, but to look into ourselves. What can we do for ourselves? How do we move away from being affected by decisions from external partners and begin to make decisions for ourselves that are good for our health? Because now they have taken away the Global Gag Rule and they've reinstated funding. But what is going to happen 4 years down the road?
Exactly.
Again, they might reinstate the Global Gag Rule, and then we end up in that form of relationship, which is just very unhealthy, especially for the people who benefit most from some of these services.
Yeah, you talked about those who benefit most, but let's speak more about those who are most affected, particularly women, with economic capacity for women, gender inequality, gender-based violence, including female genital mutilation, some of the major problems, happening to African women in the African region. We know that Africa needs to, own its own in terms of its sexual and reproductive health, but how do we then break off from this, maybe to use the term, toxic relationship with these Western-based bodies who always seem to be ready to always give out these handouts or take these handouts with some certain caveats or conditions in between, because it's the African women who are now being affected the most here.
And sorry, Rose, let me add, we're seeing money coming from Western conservative groups to fight legalization of abortion, to fight sex education curriculum, to even just fight reproductive access. What do you make of that situation as well?
Again, it goes back to us defining what sexuality education means for us as Africans, but also what does abortion mean for us as Africans, because most of the time the concepts that are being pushed are concepts that are being put forward by Western countries. But as Africans, have we sat down to inquire from ourselves, what does abortion rights mean to us? What does sexuality education mean to us as Africans? We need to begin determining concepts that are African-based. And the only way that we can do that is to begin prioritizing. Most of our leaders are prioritizing keeping themselves in power. For example, in our country, you talked about Bobi Wine and Museveni and the battle that they are having. We have most of our resources that are being expended towards the purchase of tear gas, towards the purchase of helicopters, ammunition, just so that we can protect the presidency. And in the process, we are forgetting the social services that are extended towards people. Our education systems are suffering, our health systems are suffering. We have so many of our social services that are suffering because money is being prioritized for other sectors instead of being put into the social services. So we need to deconstruct that myth that we need to protect the big man in power and come down to look at what services we need to extend to people. The only way that we are going to escape from this toxic relationship we have with the Western world and the concepts that they throw at us is for us to begin to fund our own selves using our own money. But if we are to rely on their money, then we are going to continue in this very unhealthy relationship that we are in right now.
So Lisa has called it a toxic relationship. As you're talking now, it's just basically the piper is dictating the tune. But Rose, as we wrap things up, the Joe Biden administration is saying that they are lifting it and funding and money will be going. So how soon do you expect to see some changes? Very quickly, how soon do you expect to see some changes? We know HIV, malaria, child mortality, child and mother mortality is also part of the conversation. So how swiftly do we think some of these agencies and countries will see the money and they'll be able to sort of bring their programs back on board?
When the Global Gag Rule was instated, we saw immediate change and immediately it was communicated to us. So we expect again there to be an immediate communication and perhaps grants will be opened up to all understander. So we expect it to be immediate, but the challenge is already we have effects of the Global Gag Rule that happened between 2016 and up to now. So how are they going to mitigate those effects that came about not having those funds? Because now we have a backlog of people who will need services and they need to be provided for. But then again, we have seen that the politics in America is very erratic. What happens 4 years down the road when perhaps the Global Gag Rule is reinstated?
Yes.
Then what is going to happen? So it's a little bit, we are optimistic, but we are very cautious. Even as we expect, even as it is lifted, we are very, very cautious. Because, you know, they say that once bitten, twice shy.
Yes.
So again, you look at it and think to yourself, how do I get out of this? Even more than being happy for the resources that are going to come towards us.
All right. Rose Wakikona, thank you so much. Rose is the program officer for Center for Health, Human Rights and Development. Thank you for talking to us about the Global Gag Rule and the effect on the African continent. We do appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you so much.